Hi everybody, my name is Brad Taylor. I'm the director of the Bastiat Society of Raleigh. I'd like to welcome you. And thank you very much for making time on Wednesday, September 11th. It's a fun new fourth year of the Bastiat Society. We have as our main speaker tonight, Professor Richard Salsman from Duke University. He's going to be speaking on Collegiate Cronyism, the injustice and destructiveness of student debt cancellation, which, as you know, has been a big issue. Before I get into that, I just wanted to address a couple of things. Basically, we are really fortunate and love our venue. We've had 27 quality speakers that we have offered and brought to you at this location, and that has been since we started in 2001. We started in the fall of 2001, 2, 3, yeah, that's why we're starting our fourth year, if you can believe it. We've had speakers prominently from North Carolina, but some others from out of state. We had in June, we had the former Justice of the Supreme Court Justice of the North Carolina, Mark Martin, who talked about the separation of powers. We had a former Federal Reserve economist, Dr. David Barker, adjunct climate economics. We had Winston Brady with Thales Academy on big government and machine politics. And we had his boss, entrepreneur Bob Luddy of Captive Air Systems and founder of Thales. He spoke on sound money and monetary policy. We've had Professor Salsman before speaking on national debt, inflation. Professor Munger, who's here, on regulation by the ABC Commission in North Carolina. George Leaf, who's also here. Nice to see you, George. Takers versus makers. Dr. Phil Magnus was here from AIER, critique of the 1619 project. Justice Phil Berger Jr. was here. He was speaking about life, liberty, and the fruits of your own labor, as addressed in the North Carolina Constitution. Joe Collegiate with the North Carolina Legislature, and he was telling us about what to watch for in the upcoming legislative session. UNC professor Mark McNeely talked on artificial intelligence, capitalism, and humanity. John Locke's Donna King was here. She was talking about the importance of a free press. Diana Furchtgott-Roth of Heritage flew down here from Washington. She spoke on Net Zero 2050 and the Green New Deal. And if you're worried about expenses, she wasn't that expensive. She was going to charge 10. I said we can only afford 1,000. She said, okay, I'll do it, because she likes our organization. And we basically, I was talking with George Abel. Hey, George, could you come on up? Because George has been one of our strongest supporters since the very beginning. He's one of the founding members. I invited him to be on the steering committee, and I wanted him to talk about what he's gotten out of the Bastiat Society. And if there's nothing else, I think the most important thing that I've learned is that this is a place for networking. It's a place for learning about current important trends and issues. And I started the group because I wanted to take a stand against some of the leftist insanity that's going on. And what I'd like to make clear is that as we have basically been able to afford this beautiful facility, we also have to be mindful of the cost. Basically, we figure it kind of costs about $25 per person every time. That's to have the event here at this beautiful facility, to offer a drink, some hors d'oeuvres, and we will be making some changes in 2025 in January, where we'll basically be saying, if you don't contribute, we can't invite you in. But for now, what we'd like to do is just say, please use the QR codes that you see at your tables. Make sure that you've contributed $25 unless it's your first time, or unless you're a contributing member annually or a founding member. George, do you want to say a couple things?
Yeah. First of all, Brad, thank you very much for spearheading. Without a leader, it doesn't work, right? Speed of the leader is the speed of the team.
It's been my pleasure.
And back in August of 2021, Richard, who lives down the street from me, called me up. Said, you want to go to a boys and girls night out? I go, what? I better check with my wife. Did you talk to your wife yet? And I said, sure, I'd love to. And from there, we have grown, and what we call ourselves is the Hillsborough, North Carolina Hood. And over here, we have 8 or 9 of us who come almost every time, and we have camaraderie coming over to talk about current events, what's happening in our families. We just have a good time. Most importantly right now is what they call the value proposition, which means what is the value for you and what do we need from you as well? What we're going to give you and what you're going to provide us. And as Brad said, we're self-sufficient pretty much. We get a small token from AIER every year, but those funds may be drying up this next year. So just to reinforce what Brad said, is we need everybody to help and contribute. Bastiat himself was an economist, a French economist, and Brad actually went to his house, am I right?
Yeah, in Mugron, yeah.
Before he became associated with this group here. Believe me, we have 200 of these organizations, and last year, out of 104 programs in 2023, we had 9 in our little group here. We've only been around for 3 years. We're newbies. Yeah. And Brad should take a lot of credit, along with the steering committee, who really put the time and effort to squeeze to make this work for you. So without further ado, I'd like to just, first of all, if we have any new people in the room, and their sponsors, could you just, Russ, you have one?
I was going to know, I'm Russ Patton. I'm part of the Hillsborough group. Ed Teriyaki.
Hello, Alan. Welcome.
And coming for the first time.
Do you want to say something about yourself a little bit?
Sure. So, I was fascinated to learn about this organization because I never heard of Mr. Bastiat, and what I read about it was very intriguing, and I wanted to learn more, and I heard it was such a group of esteemed, educated, in the European sense, liberal-minded or free trade-oriented, well-meaning people, which is sort of a philosophy I share. I am retired in Hillsborough. I grew up in Durham, worked abroad for many years, and then came back to retire again. Also, his brother, a very good friend of mine, who told me about this organization. I was delighted to come.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, good. And I'm sponsoring Arturo Suarez, who is also part of the Hillsborough Hood. It's a pleasure, Arturo, and you will add a lot to this organization.
Thank you.
You want to say a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm Arturo Suarez. I'm a current practicing anesthesiologist. I'm assistant professor of anesthesiology at Critical Care at Duke University. Very interesting, got to meet George, one of our neighbors, and just crossing paths, he said one day, after we had a nice talk, he said, hey, you may be interested in looking into this. Once I told him my story, how I got to this place, basically what I saw was that we should have a lot in common. That was reaffirmed once I met Mr. Salsman, and I reaffirmed that our common place was liberty, pursuit of liberty. I said, I need to go and meet him. So, and this is one, delighted to be here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take your time.
Good.
Thanks a lot, George.
Okay.
And Richard, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Thanks, George, Brad, and everyone for coming. When I give this talk, I normally ask, who has a student loan? But this is a fairly older group. So the question would be, did you ever have a student loan? Or do you have kids who have student loans? Usually all hands are up. So I thought this topic might be of interest, also because it's in the news recently, if you know. So I'll invite you to see some of that. I'm going to talk for maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then take questions, so I won't hold you too long here. This is my main point. This is really a description of the talk, that this regime has pandered to college students. Now, pandering politically, to me, that's cronyism usually means your favored group. You're the group that you give favors to or excuse things and make it easier for them. I'm stressing that these are voluntarily incurred school loans. But it's not just that. The Supreme Court responded by saying, unacceptable, you don't have the power to do that, and they're doing it anyway. So it's also interesting from the standpoint of rule of law. It's not just, I'll get into the economics of it a little bit, the history of it, the justice, the moral aspects to it, but there's also a kind of, I wouldn't call it a constitutional crisis yet, but you do have the judiciary saying you can't do that, and they're busting ahead and doing it anyway. Notice I also say here, just to hedge my bets, if Trump-Vance wins, I think Kamala Harris would continue this policy, and maybe even worse. But I don't even think the other side would dare stand up and say, start paying your loans again. Because they have suspended these loan payments for almost 2 years now. So to get them up and going again, which is supposed to start next month, it's going to be a daring thing to do. So I'm going to explain how we got here. Show you some history, show you some headlines. And I don't think this can be understood until you get the politics and the economics and the morals of it and the history of it. Well, that's a lot. That's a mouthful. Thought I'd start with this. Everyone likes graphs. This one's fairly simple. Total federal student loans are now near 1.8 trillion. But this only starts in 1989. That's not when the story starts. That's when this chart starts. And the numbers down there were in the billions. So this is quite an increase over the last, what is this now, 35 years? And you can visually see that this particular stretch, where it's really going up, it's leveled off a little bit since, and I'll tell you why in a moment. I calculated an 8.2% growth per year for 20 years. That's a lot. Well, here's the more recent stuff, but I'm leading up to where we are today. This is what? Candidate Biden, right? That's 2020. So as early as then, he had said, I'm going to look for an immediate cancellation of a minimum of $10,000 of student debt per person. This is going to ease the economic burden on working people. So there's roughly the first mention of it. The CARES Act, by the way, was the act that sent checks to people because of the COVID lockdown. So he, in this period, is suggesting, well, Trump is still president. It's saying that's what I would do if I were president. I think it's also interesting to ease the economic burden on working people. Last time I checked, students aren't working people. They sometimes work in class. They do homework and stuff. But they're not technically working yet, are they? President Biden extends student loan payment freeze. All right, this is inaugural day. He's president now. So one of the first things he does is he writes an executive order. What freeze? When COVID lockdowns occurred, they told the students you don't have to pay your loans. They're not canceled yet, but you just don't have to pay interest and principal while this freeze is on. So they kept extending the freeze. They've extended it 8 times. So that's part of what's recently been happening, but I'm going to go even further back. Now here's a case of, this is a year and a half ago. The Supreme Court said you can't do that. You can't forgive the loans. They didn't say you can't freeze the payments. But Biden started talking about, cancel them. Not just you don't have to pay them. I'm going to cancel them. I'm going to wipe them out. And at first it was 300 billion, 400 billion. Remember, the total amount is 1.7 trillion. So like 500 billion would be, what, a third of the debt. And a couple of analysts, I think Wharton analyzed this, and they said, if you look in the details of it, it's actually probably closer to $1 trillion would be canceled by this measure. But the Supreme Court ruled that he doesn't have the power to do that. It's an overbroad step on the executive branch's side. Now, they're kind of saying if Congress agreed to it, that might be okay. So it's not really a fundamental objection to canceling loans, but it is saying the president can't do it unilaterally. But Biden went ahead with it anyway. Notice how many people it affects, 45 million. It's a lot of voters. Oh, did I say voters? It can't be related to that. This is more recent, cancels nearly 5 billion more. So it's like eking out like, wow, this week 5 billion, next week 10. So they think if they do it by baby steps, maybe people won't notice. The White House announcement brings the total loan forgiveness approved by Biden and Harris to what is it, 136 billion, more than 3.7 million Americans. Now this I love, this I like. You have to understand that even before all this, students were in default on their loans. This is called delinquency. You know, on your credit card, if it's past due 90 days or more, it's called delinquent. And that's usually a leading indicator of default. Well, the red line is the student default line. Notice how it was going up, up, up. I mean, these numbers are high. This is 12%. That's very high. Now, we had a recession, So even auto loans and home equity loans, the default rate goes up, but then it goes back down to normal. See how elevated the student loan delinquency rate stays? It stays up there come hell or high water. During recessions and recoveries, they're defaulting at a fairly high rate. But why did it plummet? Look, Biden, here's the CARES Act of March 2020. Biden takes office January 21. The thing plummets to zero. Why? Then all of a sudden they started paying. No, he said you don't have to pay. So it immediately, it by definition, it becomes you're not late on your payment if you don't have to pay. Crazy. By the way, it's for all ages. This is within the student loan program by age. I had no idea 49-year-olds still had student debt, but apparently they do. And by the way, that number, the 1.7 trillion, half of it is grad school debt. Not undergrad, grad school. The ones getting PhDs and stuff. Well, they all plummeted, of course. But you can see how high the serious delinquency rates are. They're up in the 12, 15 range, even for older people. The younger ones aren't quite defaulting at a higher rate yet. So fun and favor for all ages. Huh. How do we get here? I'm going to give you a little history. Not too much, but it is amazing because it's an 80-year-old story. You would think this happened starting like 5 years ago. It started 80 years ago under FDR. But here's the key thing. From the time the country was founded until World War II, that's a long time. That's, what, 150 years? There was no government involvement in student loans, certainly. Not much at all in colleges, although there were land grant colleges. It was totally a private sector thing. And you could get student loans. So understand here, I'm not saying student loans aren't legitimate. If you find a person, a young person especially, and they're studying hard and they have a potential, it's like investing in a business in a way, right? They're eventually going to get a job. So there was private lending going on, but there was no government involvement in student loans. And of course, colleges themselves, Harvard, Yale, Duke was around that. They were endowed by benefactors, right? Rich people would give money to universities. Alumni would give money to universities out of gratitude for where, right? And that money would be used to help financial aid to students, right? That still happens today to some degree. So that's not government involvement. So the idea of saying government should not be involved in this is not the same thing as saying there would be no funding forthcoming in a private sector realm. And of course, why would middle class or poor people get the money too? Because they have potential. They have brains, they have good grades, they have good discipline. So it wasn't just rich kids getting this aid. And of course, if you were in the business world and didn't even go to college, in a way there was a kind of training going on because there'd be internships, there'd be apprenticeships, ample opportunities. So you didn't have to go to college to succeed in the business world. Now, I'm going to give you a sequence here of about 12 things, but very succinctly described. Sometimes I'll give you the actual wording of the legislation, but I think it begins with this. And it seems to have nothing to do with college loans. It's the draft. It's the military draft. And interestingly, he institutes it before the U.S. is in the war, in 1940. When did the U.S. get in the war? After Pearl Harbor. December 41, right? So it's interesting, there is war going on in Europe, but we're not in it, and he starts the military draft. Controversial. Eventually they drafted 10 million, mostly men. Well, of course, then there's Pearl Harbor. All right, well, here's the key. 3 years later, here it starts. That's why I say it's 80 years old. He signs the GI Bill. It's called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. Understand the war isn't even over yet. This is it. The war ended in the spring of 45 in Europe. So this is during the war. So I get this is just from Wikipedia, just look up GI Bill. The bill provided a range of benefits for some of the returning World War II vets. Now listen to this. At first, FDR believed that satisfactory employment for these vets, not educational opportunity, was the key feature of the bill. But this changed while the bill was going through Congress. In the fall of 44, when one of his advisors reported on the vets' post-war expectations, he had an advisor who was interviewing the vets. What do you expect to do when you come back? What do you think your opportunities will be? housing. GI Bill has housing assistance and things like that. And they said, we're going to go to college. I have no idea how we're going to be able to go to college. So from that, Serviceman wanted educational opportunities, proved this unavailable. When FDR heard this, he lit up. He's very excited. Cha-ching, or whatever the equivalent is in political. Get the vets vote. Get the vets vote. The vets vote. Well, no, he's just being altruistic with somebody else's money. And the advisor recalled this, and subsequent additions to the bill included provisions for higher education. That's it, that's the beginning. Just soldiers, just vets, the ones that came back not dead. Who would object to helping the soldiers? Who would object to helping the vets? This isn't going to balloon into anything stupid, is it? You see the argument at the time? Who would object to this? Oh, I love the posters. Come to college, servicemen. And posters. Veterans prepare for future through educational training. I was looking at this and I was trying to figure out whether that's Duke or not. I don't think it is. It might be Princeton. Eisenhower. What the heck is Eisenhower doing? 1958. The National Defense Education Act. Why? What happened in 1957, the year before? Sputnik. Oh my God, the USSR. They have more scientists than we do. We need an education bill, not for vets, but to train physicists and future NASA guys and math. It funded U.S. education institutions at all levels. It was among many science initiatives. What are you going to be? Are you against science? The vets, the science? To increase the technological sophistication and power of the U.S. It reflected a growing national sense that U.S. scientists were falling behind scientists in the Soviet Union. Because the U.S. launched the first ever satellite, Sputnik, in '57. The act authorized funding for 4 years and increased funding per year, over $1 billion in then time money. That's a lot. Was directed towards improving American math and science curriculum. Again, you imagine the debate at the time? It's just science and math. It's our future engineers. So we got vets, future mathematicians and engineers. This thing's not going to go off the rails, is it? Oh boy, the Great Society. 7 years later, LBJ's Great Society ain't doing enough for higher education. The Higher Education Act. By the way, 1965 was also Medicare and Medicaid. So making inroads into the medical field, but also here education. Now this is from Wikipedia as well. These are not my words, I'm just taking it from the description. The HEA was part of the Great Society agenda. The law was intended to strengthen the educational resources of our colleges and universities and provide financial assistance for students in post-secondary and higher education. Notice it's broad now, just students. Non-science students, not vets, just students. It increased federal money given to universities, created scholarships, gave low-interest loans. That's the beginning of, wow, we're not even charging them high interest because these are risky kids. Now give them low-interest loans. In other words, not market-based loans. Establish a national teachers corps. I don't know what that was. Look at all the reauthorizations. Reauthorized in 68, 72, 76, 80, 86, 92, 98, and 2008. Of course, every time it came up for renewal, who's going to sit there and say, no, no more of this. I'm putting an end to this. No. LBJ told Congress, higher education it's no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. Like food and water. You have to be old enough to remember Sallie Mae. Do you remember Sallie Mae? Sallie Mae is a silly acronym for the Student Loan Marketing Association. This is 1972. So what FDR had done, that wasn't enough. What Ike had done, not enough. LBJ, not enough. Now, 72. Nixon signed this one. Nixon signed it. To create a government-sponsored enterprise that subsequently made billions in student loans and guaranteed student loans. So there's still private lending, but the government comes in and says, we'll guarantee the loans if they go bust, and we'll pay the banks. It grew into a corrupt lobbying arm for students and lenders. It perpetually lobbied and bribed Congress for taxpayer backing. That was what it was based on. I'll get to this later. It was terminated, interestingly, in 2010 by Obama, but for a very specific reason. And I just want to point out here, does it sound like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, these stupid auntie-type names they give to these agencies, that contributed to the housing crisis by guaranteeing subprime loans to people? You remember, this is 12 years ago, 14 years ago. So they had a lot to do with wrecking, I thought, contaminating and wrecking the mortgage market and the housing market, leading to the 08 crisis. But that crisis is largely based on blaming the lenders. Remember, they called it predatory lending. And that's part of the story in student loans. Part of the reason the government gets more involved is that we can't let these kids be affected by predatory lenders taking advantage of them. Well, what was that, 72? It just goes on and on and on. 7 years later, Department of Education. We need an entire cabinet agency. There hadn't been one. So Jimmy Carter, one of the last things he did before Reagan beat him was to set up a Department of Education. The Department of Energy was also set up roughly that year. But there's the building, there's the pretty building in Washington. Notice the New York Times, a victory for Carter. September 79. Oh, this is just a fast forward to a couple of years ago. This is the same building, only it's been defiled with arguments for canceling student debt. What? That's all about rioting, rioting, cancel student debt. So this is the same building. What's that night, of course, though? With wow, it sounds like it's projected light. I don't think it's graffiti, but why the heck would they be going to the Department of Education all of a sudden? And what do they got to do with student loans? At this point, it's just a department. It's not doing it. It's not guaranteeing any loans. That's Sally Mae. It's just a department. Who could object to an education department? All right, that's going fast forward a little too much. So let's go backward. 2002. What was happening then? Oh, 9/11 was just before then. So I love this. I love the acronyms. The HEROES Act, Higher Education Relief Opportunities for Students Act. George Bush. What did it try to do? Relieve and suspend debt payments by soldiers. Does that sound familiar? It allowed the U.S. Secretary of Education, well, you can do this now because there's a Department of Education, so then they give the power of that official to grant waivers or relief to recipients of student financial aid programs under Title IV of the Higher Education Act of '65, which was LBJ's Act. You see how this builds on? It builds on prior acts. Oh, they did this, let's go a step further, now do this. It waives loan servicing for active duty military or National Guard officials, those who reside or are employed in disaster areas, goes on and on. Extended in '03, extended in '05, made permanent in '07. Meanwhile, this kind of thing is going on. This is 2009. So this is 7 years later. What is this all about? Obama is president, and he starts going after private lenders. So the trend is toward more and more government involvement in student loans, but there's still this private sector loan lending going on out there. Obama targets them. He wants to get rid of them. Kind of like getting rid of private health insurance. If you want Obamacare, get rid of any competition, monopolize the whole thing, maybe. In the middle of the financial crisis, so nobody thinks of focusing in on that. The college student loan business was reeling on Thursday from an unexpected proposal in the 2010 budget to axe the guaranteed loans program of Sally Mae. So on the surface, it looks like well, maybe he's ratcheting back government involvement in student loans. What's happening here? A lot of money's involved. What is he doing? Wait till you see what he's doing. It's brilliant if you're pro-Obama. Oh, he's doing what others are doing. I'm calling for loan forgiveness in return for public service. This is brilliant. January 2010, he basically says, if you have a lot of student debt and you incurred it voluntarily, we'll cancel the debt if you work for the government. Brilliant. And in any capacity, really. So that's what the public service aspect of it. If you go into public service, you don't have to pay your debt. So it's kind of a lure to get people into public service, and part of the argument was, get paid that much in public service. So why would you come with a $100,000 debt from some Ivy League school you can't pay? We face a deficit of trust in Washington, deep and corrosive doubts about how our system works, he says. We need to close this credibility gap, take action, and get rid of these lobbyists. The lobbyists he's talking about are from Sallie Mae, the GSE, which was a very corrupt organization. But instead of saying it's a corrupt organization because government's getting involved in this field, he goes this route of, let me basically bribe students into coming into the government by canceling their debt. He did have to get congressional approval because he couldn't do that unilaterally. Here's the key. You nationalized the whole damn thing in 2010. It's a piece of Obamacare. It's tucked into the massive healthcare Obamacare bill. Right in the middle of it is we nationalize all the student loans. Nationalize meaning you owe the Department of Education now. There's no banks involved. There's no Sallie Mae. Sallie Mae goes away. But the reason it goes away is not because he's trying to get government out of student loans. It goes away because he's going to nationalize the loan market. Now at the time it was maybe 1.5 trillion. You owe it straight to the Department of Education, which didn't exist until Carter set it up in '79, right? So see how things build on each other? At this point, last time I checked, I totaled up all the student loans in America. 96% of them have been nationalized. There's only like 4% of private student loans. Anyway, you see the sequencing? 1940, bunch of stuff. This is all the stuff I covered previously. But this is the biggie, 2010. And that was a long time ago, it was 14 years ago. And almost no one knows this. Almost, if you said, what's going on with student loans? There's a bunch of banks are owed these loans, like maybe these banks decide they're gonna cancel these loans or forgive them. No, it's totally run by the government with a lot of power attached to that. If you're the lender, and you're the only lender in town, you have a lot of power. Now this is part of the story. Does anyone remember this? Right around the same time, this is 2010, he nationalizes it, and there had already been a financial crisis, and there had already been TARP, and the TARP was the bailout of the banks, which Obama voted for, by the way. And people were pissed. So they had an Occupy Wall Street moment. But look when it is, it's 2011. Obama has already nationalized the student loan program. And notice what they're saying. Bailouts are terrible. No more bank bailouts. People before profits. Foreclose on the banks, not people, right? So you get the, okay, however mangy these people may look, at least they seem to be against bailouts. Except they want their own bailouts of student loans. So many of them are probably sitting there with like a sociology degree from Vassar, and they owe $300,000, and they're like, bail me out. Now, it didn't take me 4 minutes to go on the internet, because I kind of knew this was happening, and find the images and the placards. This one says, I'll never get a job in this economy. This placard says, I'll never own a home in my life. And this one says, I'll never pay off my student loans. Here's a flag asking for the loans to be forgiven. Big banks stole our future, so let's steal the money back from them. So they're not really against bailouts. They're using this as a pretext. It's not a bad reason. I mean, I'd be pissed too. You bail out the banks, and we still owe them, but you weren't owing them anymore. You were owing the education department. That's the end of Sallie Mae. This is him also going after for-profit colleges. That's another subsector. And they basically run them out of business. So ITT, occupational, is mostly have vocational schools. Had a bunch of students, had upward of 800,000. But they were for-profit. And some of those kids were getting student loans. A lot of them were getting student loans. So Obama went after them, not saying, we're gonna relieve you of your student loans, but run the colleges out of business, because they were exploiting the students. So a completely different tack taken for those kids who owed student loans, not to help them, but to run their colleges out of business, which is very interesting coming from the Democrats, because they normally think in terms of the working man, the labor union. I mean, these colleges produced nurses and accountants and plumbers and things like that. Pushes profit colleges to the brink. Yes, most of them have failed. And now we're up to Biden. updating this in the last 3 years. Biden suspends loan servicing, proposes a cancellation of upwards of $1 trillion federal debts, and defies lower court and SCOTUS rulings against the policy. Here's just a bigger visual of the whole history I just gave you. There's nothing back here. But then it starts showing, this is government spending on various things. Primary, pre-primary, the tertiary is college, and college is red. And notice the spike in red, but the whole trend is upward. And this is as a share of GDP. Government spending on this, just spending on education. This is not the loans directly. How about this one? The cost of tuition, which is in the CPI, you can go get it at the Fed, relative to the CPI, which is all items. So this is since 1979. I picked 1979 because that's when they started the Department of Education, which was going to make college so much more affordable. It's completely unaffordable. So this green line is the tuition and other school fees has grown 6% per annum, while the CPI for all items has grown 3.2% per annum for, 44 years. It's almost twice as much. It must be because the quality of the service at schools are so much better. Because they're coming out with higher GPAs and stuff like that. There is grade inflation. I couldn't even get to that point. There's so much to show here. And you might ask, wait a minute, did all the government subsidies and loan guarantees and maybe that contributed to this? Is that a theory? Like, you see what I mean? Like, we're going to make it more affordable. Here's a bunch of money. And the colleges just raise their prices. Right? Maybe that happened. The studies have shown, and guess where the studies came from? The Fed. Yeah, the Fed New York said yes. The answer, yes. Have government student loans inflated college tuitions? Yes. Federal Reserve, I don't know, 7 years ago, the link between student credit expansion, we've certainly seen that, over the past 15 years, so this is just 2002 to now, and the contemporaneous rise in college tuition. We find a pass-through effect. In other words, you got more money to spend, we'll raise the prices, pass it right through to tuition's going up. The subsidized loan effect is most pronounced for more expensive degrees. So the Ivy League loves this. All right, let me finish with this. It's wrong not only economically, but I think it's morally wrong. If you voluntarily borrow, whether you're borrowing from a bank or your uncle or the taxpayer, I know the sentence are different, but it's just morally wrong to renege on your debts. It's a kind of promise, it's a kind of pledge. Credit itself means the origin of credit is credibility. Do you have any, are you credible as a person, are you moral? But economically, it's very damaging. Not only are they funding degrees, and there's degree inflation going on, that are economically worthless. That's a problem as well. But the idea of just rearranging the whole credit structure and it getting to the tune of 1.7 trillion, it messes up the credit system. Because it's more and more moving away from market discipline, and now it's almost completely government. And nationalization is a form of socialism. I mean, when you nationalize industries, when Latin America nationalized banks years ago, that is a form of socialism. That's effectively what's happened to the student loan market. I'm worried about this, a complete loss of independence of universities. By independence, I mean political independence. I mean being able to speak their mind and have academic freedom. It isn't just the loans, it isn't just the student loan thing. There's also research and development money pouring into the universities, especially the research universities. And they're gonna be less likely to bite the hand that feeds them, right? Or come up with research that counters what the government funders are doing. So the NIH is a funder, the National Science Foundation, a whole bunch of them. And you could say, why aren't the alums funding these things? And the government argument is, unless we put billions into these schools, they won't have the research and development that's necessary at all. But again, if you're being subsidized, you run the risk of tailoring your message to who's paying the bill, who's subsidizing it. This is a more philosophic point, but there is a long-term kind of latent hostility to any kind of lender, let alone lending to a student. And it goes way back to Aristotle. Aristotle said money is barren. How can you make money from money? This is what lending is, right? And even in Christianity, there's a long history of distrust of usury. It was banned. Usury wasn't just charging a high interest rate, it was charging interest at all. It took a long time more than 1,000 years before, I mean, eventually Jeremy Bentham, in defense of usury, they started defending the idea of lending at interest. Shakespeare, you know, Merchant of Venice. You get Shylock, right? I'm going to extract my pound of flesh. The evil guy is the banker. Scrooge is the evil banker, right? Like when you think of how many imagery there is of the bad banker. Keynes said we should euthanize the lenders. He didn't mean physically. He said we need to, that was his phrase, euthanize the rentier class. Rentier class is people who lend, bondholders. And by euthanize, he meant, I'm not going to gas them. Their interest rate has to be zero. So in the General Theory in 1936, the book that transformed economic teaching, he says right in there, they're functionless. Lenders are like parasites. Marx has said that as well. And we need really low interest rates so they aren't incentivized to lend. I think some of the weak arguments against politicized loan would be something like, hey, I already paid my loan back, so it's unfair that somebody else is being forgiven. That could easily be countered by Biden and Harris stepping up saying, okay, show me the receipts of the loans you paid in the past, and we'll write you a check. So you see how it's not really a fundamental argument against doing this. It's just like a double standard. It's like, why do they get forgiven, but I didn't get forgiven? But it's not really a fundamental argument. It's basically saying, if you forgive all of us, all the debts we ever paid, that would be okay. That's not a good argument. Another one would be, well, you shouldn't do this because they'll have more you should cancel them because they'll have more spending power. Like if they're not paying their mortgage, or they're not paying their student loans, they'll be able to spend more. A Keynesian argument for why that would somehow stimulate the economy. Last thing, Trump actually said that he would abolish the US Department of Education. That surprised me. I didn't expect that. I don't think it'll actually happen, but this is where the lending is now. I walked you through the history, right? If you got rid of that department, you would have to get rid of the lending. Does that mean you privatize the whole portfolio? How do you do that? A $1.8 trillion portfolio? Privatize it by what? Giving it back to Wall Street? Can you imagine the hatred and the resistance? I don't know if it can be done. Reagan, by the way, tried to stop and end the US Department of Education in 1980. In 1981, I should say. 2 years after it began, he couldn't do it. So I don't think that's a solution either. I finished with just saying that the only way, and this is some of the stuff I've written that's related, the only way to counter this, I think it's philosophical, but that's a much longer argument. I think in the meantime, if some of the legal restrictions on the power of just unilaterally canceling these debts, if some of those can be upheld, and then the executive branch actually follows the rule of law, that would be the beginnings of some people realizing at least there has to be some kind of rationality and fairness applied to this problem, to this issue. So I'll stop there and take questions. Thanks. Yes, George?
To your point that political lending is morally and economically wrong, let me add something. It is utterly unconstitutional. Nothing in the Constitution authorizes any branch of the government to lend money to anybody. But when these programs were pushed forward by LBJ especially, the Supreme Court had no tolerance for people making arguments as to the limitations on government power. And so nobody challenged it. And therefore it's been growing like topsy ever since, as you show so well in your talk.
Good point. You notice the pattern also of you give it to groups that are not really questioned, like vets. But once you do that, or, guys, there's other cases of this, the scientists, right, for Sputnik. Everyone loved NASA, everyone loved getting on the moon and all that kind of stuff. But the philosophical, logical point is you accept the premise. You concede the principle, and it's a really powerful message of if you concede a principle, then people will just take it and run it to its logical conclusion. If the vets, then why not me? If me, why not my neighbor? It's a spiller, and it takes a while. It doesn't happen overnight. But you can see how that works. And same thing with the bailouts. Like if there had been no bailout of the banks with TARP, there might not have been an Occupy Wall Street. There might not have been therefore a request for student loan cancellation, right? So the other message here is one government intervention causes a problem, which leads to a demand for still more government intervention. It gets worse and worse, unless at some point someone steps up and says, wait a minute, the problem here is the original government intervention. We have to stop doing this. That's really the problem. But that's almost never true. In that part about animosity toward the lender, I mean, predatory lending is a standard thing that comes off of people's lips, right? What's actually going on is predatory borrowing. No lender wants to lose money. No lender wants a loan that goes bad. But if you can get a loan and get whatever you're getting, the degree, the house, and then say, oh, I'm sorry I did that, and then say, I'm not going to pay, who's actually stealing from who? The predation is the borrower. So even the terminology is so interesting because the victims are described as predators. As the victims are the ones who lend money and never got it back. Interestingly, the Department of Education could say, see this program, we're forgiving things, we're making sure we're not predators. We're nice. We're angelic bankers. We're not going to demand payment from all these students, plus they might vote for us. But see, but they're also saying, see, we're not predacious like these Wall Street sharks who are demanding pay your loans. Michael, did you have your hand up?
Thanks, Dr. Salsman. I don't know you, but Wilmer might know exactly the history here. I thought that with Stephen from Ballard, I thought that he wrote in Capital and Interest, whatever, 40 years prior to Keynes, like demonstrated why interest is productive.
Yes.
So I don't know if Keynes was just ignorant of that or just disagreed with it, but it's just so striking. If he was such a financial wizard, wouldn't he have read Ballard and known about this?
That is a good question. The question was, when Keynes wrote this in 1936, was there no economist defending the legitimacy of interest and its productive aspect in lending? Yes, there were. So he was in many ways a detour from good economics. But that was true on a lot of things because he also went protectionist. And he had a couple of chapters in the end about mercantilism. So, and you know, he was an inflationist, of course. He was against the gold standard, he blamed that. So on every level, Keynes overthrew a fairly classical economics in the good sense that had been in place since 1870, the neoclassical model that had overturned Marx. So yeah, there's no excuse. I would say there's no excuse for that, except he's looking around and saying the Great Depression occurred, the stock market crashed, let's blame the bankers. I mean, it's a very common story, especially when people say, stock market, finance, I know nothing about that. Maybe these dastardly people did it. And of course, the government would want to be in a position of saying that, because they're not going to say, we're at the Fed and we did it. So they're loving this story that deflects attention away from them. I missed Marx in that sequence. I should have put Marx in that sequence of hating bankers. The whole Marxist literature is filled with finance as parasitic. Bankers are blood-sucking, you know, what, the physical worker, the manual laborer is the only one who produces wealth. That's the Marxist labor theory of value. Well, what is the most opposite kind of worker? Someone just using their brain and lending money and deciding where to invest, right? So to Marx, you're not getting dirt under your fingernails. You must be a parasite. That could, and Keynes picked up a lot on that. Keynes had this kind of Marxist view of the financial markets. It's a casino. They're just shuffling paper. They're screwing people over. They're charging overly high interest rates.
Is this like the socialist calculation debate? It's like you have to dodge from academia, 30 years goes by and they're like, oh, you know what, just ignore that generation.
They did.
In fairness,
Yeah.
the economics profession, they did not adopt Keynes' view of interest rates.
Who?
The economics profession, the government may have, but the economics profession didn't. I mean, the Chicago school certainly doesn't think.
Okay, all right, here's my pushback. ZIRP, zero interest rate policy. That is exactly what Keynes asked for in 1936.
Well,
ZIRP, zero interest rate policy.
yeah.
It was first adopted by the Bank of Japan. After their crash in '89, they brought interest rates down to zero. Now, it wasn't pitched as bankers are evil, so make sure they get no rate of return. But it was a very Keynesian policy, because Keynes's policy was, if you're in a recession and depression, bring the interest rate down to zero. And then the Fed did it. Bernanke copied Bank of Japan. That's a total Keynesian
I'm not
policy.
saying policymakers. I'm saying I said in defense of the economics profession.
There's no Keynesians? There's no Keynesians in the economics?
That aspect of Keynes.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I've taken a lot of macro classes, right?
Yes.
None of them ever said that. None of them ever, I mean, there's a lot of Keynesian economics in there, but not, gee, we should have zero interest rates. So
Or
think-
the premise that financial sector is risky, not productive, a casino, irrational exuberance. Alan Greenspan had that. Alan Greenspan, who should know better. Remember, he claimed the markets in '95 when they were irrational exuberance. These people bubble, all the bubble language. But what is bubble? You guys don't know what you're talking about. You're blowing up. This is air. This is not real. You're inflating stock prices. You're inflating. Any bubble argument is Keynesian. The whole Keynesian argument is it's not real. The financial sector is blowing up things, and then it's going to pop. And anyway, we could talk offline. But I think the Keynesian premise is all over the place in macro.
No, I think Keynesian's everywhere. I think
That particular doctrine, that doctrine's there too.
That particular doctrine
Is still there. It's not the only doctrine, but it's still there, I think. And therefore showing up in policy. Yeah.
So I loved your comment about FDR's having that epiphany when it was brought up that he could institute this program for the GI Bill.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure he genuinely wanted
Yeah.
to help the
Yeah.
vets, but
Yeah.
the bigger issue was whether this would be a great opportunity for the government ultimately just to control, to extend its control. And now, of course, you have this situation where the Department of Education and such, I mean, they're basically doing away with, isn't it correct, with private loans.
Yeah.
And what better way to control institutions of education and to indoctrinate kids in universities if you're going to control the money and how it goes to
Yeah.
whom.
So it's partly an electoral motive.
Yeah.
But yes, this other motive, I think, is most politicians do know that if you make a group dependent on you
Right.
for favors, whether it could be even deregulation, we'll deregulate you. And you get a certain kind of dependence and a loyalty from that sector. And if you can pull that off, you have electoral wins, as far as the eye can see.
Right.
And then, of course, if you also know the principle of, that's not the end of it. We're going to do this, and this will probably grow. What did Ronald Reagan say one time? The closest thing to eternal life on this planet is to start a government program or agency that never goes out of existence. Not only never goes out of existence, just grows and grows and grows like Topsy. They must know that too.
Yeah.
Others, should we quit? We done? Any more? Oh, one more? Okay. Ed? Yeah.
Just wondering if you could comment on the peripheral problem. Do you not think that this proliferation of availability of student loans with the expectation of being able to be forgiven creates this horrible disincentive
Yeah.
to go to college
Yes.
when in fact it may not
Yeah.
economically be
Right.
the wise choice for a lot of people?
Yes. Yes, I think that's exactly possible. I thought you were going also with the root of, if they know these are going to be canceled, why wouldn't they borrow all the more? And so this situation is going to get worse. And if they borrowed all the more, and that chart went from 1.8 trillion, say, to 2.5 trillion in the next 5 years because of that, you see, what the politicians, it'd be even harder for them to end it. Because it'd be precisely because it's so big and it's affecting so many people. But yes, I mean, anyone would have this idea of, really, I'm not responsible for my debts, and I still want to go to college. Can I still get these loans? Yeah, you just call up the Department of Education, you can still get these loans, while this controversy is going on in the background of whether you'll ever have to pay them back or not. And of course, the universities aren't going to do anything. They're like, this is great. There have been some people, I don't know if you realize this, some people like Tucker Carlson and others have said, when these loans go bad, why don't you go back to the endowment of the college?
Yeah. Yeah.
By the way, especially if you don't get a degree, do you know how that works? If you go to college for 3 years and gave them a lot of money and borrowed from the Department of Education and didn't finish, you don't even have the asset. Right. At the end of the day, you don't even have the asset, but you have the liability. And that's happening, not at the elite schools so much, but that's happening way more than you'd imagine. And again, you could say to the universities, you promised a degree here. You took me in, I failed. Did you take me in just to get my money? And then why aren't there any suits going back to the universities for this? But on the other hand, I did a quick calculation. I just totaled up the top endowment numbers for like the top 25 colleges. So I went and found how big is the Yale endowment? How big is it? Yeah, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Duke. It's nothing compared to 1.8 trillion. So you couldn't even possibly even go after any part of that because it only adds up to like 500 billion, 400 billion. And that's their entire endowment. If someone just came along and said, I'm going to take 10% of that and pay off some of this debt so the taxpayers don't have to, that's not even doable. And it would be the universities would go up against the government. They'd be very angry at the government. There's one more thing I talked to somebody about recently that might interest you. They said, can you wipe out the whole thing and start fresh? Because what's the national debt? 35 trillion. This is what, approaching 2? Here's a possible proposal. You go to the Treasury and you say, borrow 2 trillion more. Now we're up to 37, but it's only and get rid of all the student debt. Cancel all of it, just like you're trying to do. But you draw a line and say, no more government borrowing from us, no more student loans. And I see some of you are shaking your heads already because you're like, that'll never happen. But you see how you could strike a deal that says, okay, we will wipe this clean, because the whole thing is fraudulent. We're sorry, we never should have got into this, and now it's 1.7 trillion, but here's a way to get out of it, but we have to end the program after that. That might be electorally interesting to people, but we don't believe they're credibly going to keep their hands off this market, do we? It's a potential solution, but it also doesn't solve the moral problem of why would you let any of these people off the hook? Yes, Arturo, one more?
I think it's brilliantly done by the government. Some time ago I read a paper that was referring to the future of slavery. Future slavery, the author was a British author. I'm going to find it and forward it to you. It refers how the masses, they transferred, they gave away their freedom from the owner, from the company owner to the government. And in that case, it's a brilliant move from the government, because in the past, it used to be seen as the future slavery. Maybe we are in the presence of the current slavery. When all those individuals that take the loans, knowing that they will not be able to pay back, they took all those high degrees that they wouldn't need. So basically what they did is that I gave you my freedom. I gave you everything I am, and I'm going to vote for whatever you decide. I'm going to be quiet with whatever you propose. You're going to be my new lord.
There's another aspect of this that you wouldn't find in the private market. If in a private market, a company, a person, a potential student went to the bank, what's the first thing a rational banker would say? What degree are you getting? How smart are you? What school are you going to? What are your job prospects? Now, if he says, computer science, MIT, I have these connections, I think I'm going to get a job at Raytheon. Okay, here's $300,000. The banker might do that. Or might have daddy co-sign the loan or get some collateral, right? But what happens here is the same person who steps up at the Department of Education and says, here's my profile. I'm a sociology major, Bryn Mawr, I study transgender, dance lessons, and I have no job prospects, whatever. I can't find any job I would really get. Give me $300,000. And the Department of Education basically says, okay. Why? Because you don't want to discriminate. But the whole point of lending is discriminating. Like you have discriminating taste, right, in cigars or in wine or in women or men. That should be a good thing, right? You're not promiscuous about your choices. And that's how lending works. I was a lender for many years. You can't be promiscuous in your lending, but that's part of the program on the grounds that egalitarian, everyone should get a loan no matter what studies they're pursuing, what prospects they have. Brad,
thank you very much, Richard.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I know there's a lot of hard work to put that together. Really appreciate it.
Well,
and it's just another topic that goes to show, you hate to be cynical, but what's going on with the left and how they think differently. So thank you very much for coming. I want to plug the next event, which is Donors Under Fire, and the topic is donor intent, and that's with Joanne Florino of the James G. Martin Center. They're proponents of reform in higher education, and really it goes to the whole question of donors giving their money and then finding out that the money's not going to where they want it to go. So I want to encourage you again to please make sure you're inviting friends, telling people about us on social media. And thank you again. I'll see you on October 9th. Thank you.